My name is Hannes Westerman, and today I will talk to you about the JusticeBot project, using artificial intelligence to increase access to justice. First, a bit about myself. I'm a PhD student at University of Montreal, but I'm also working with the Cyber Justice Lab at the JusticeBot project under the supervision of Professor Karin Benjicliff. So let's get started. I will first talk a bit about the background of the JusticeBot project, why it's necessary. Then I will talk about artificial intelligence, what it is and how it can help us. And then introduce the JusticeBot project and show you a prototype we've been working on. Next, I'll discuss a bit how we built this prototype and how our work is going with that. And finally talk about the JusticeBot challenge, which is a research challenge based on JusticeBot data. But first, let's go to the background. So the background is that laymen have trouble resolving everyday legal issues. And there's kind of two main reasons for this. One being that law is very complicated. It's very hard for laymen to understand. And also, the court costs are very high. I'm not just talking about monetary costs here, although those are very high. It is expensive to hire a lawyer and go to court, which means that many people self-represent instead. But it also takes a long time. There's high temporal costs, which means that people have to spend months or even years looking at legal issues and trying to resolve conflicts. And finally, there's high psychological costs. It can be very stressful or even humiliating to go to court. This raises fundamental questions about the rule of law. If there's no good structured way people can use to solve their legal disputes, one can really question if the law actually has an impact on the country, if it's not really expressed in how people solve their conflicts. Now, this is a really widespread issue. It's estimated that 50% of Canadians will encounter a difficult legal issue. And unresolved issues, that is people choosing not to go to court, can cost up to $746 million annually in Canada. Now, the typical issues laymen face are of low intensity but of very high volume. That is, they're not necessarily very legally complex, but there's often quite a lot of them. One example of these cases is, for example, landlord-tenant disputes. A report came out saying that issues with mold take on average 4.5 years to solve in front of the Régie de Logement, which is the tribunal responsible for these issues. So one possible solution to this is the kind of very new and up-and-coming field of artificial intelligence. So I thought I would introduce that a bit. Artificial intelligence in general can be defined very broadly as machines exhibiting signs of intelligence. Often there's separation between general artificial intelligence and narrow artificial intelligence. General artificial intelligence is very advanced systems that can kind of think as humans can and take lessons from one area and apply them to the other. Now, it's a bit hard to know if an artificial intelligence is artificial general intelligence. So there's been a number of different tests proposed. For example, the coffee cup tests. This test says that a robot has to be able to go into an unknown house and prepare a cup of coffee. Now, this is something that might be very simple for humans, but for robots it's basically impossible at this stage. And in general, the point about general artificial intelligence is that we're not really there yet, and we don't also know how to get there. But the other branch of artificial intelligence, and narrow artificial intelligence, is also very exciting and much more progressed. Now, narrow artificial intelligence is AI that is focused on a specific problem. There's different types of how to build such systems. And over the 80s, expert systems, for example, were very popular, whereas recently machine learning has become the rising star, and it is what drives the modern development of AI. And I thought I would briefly discuss the difference between those two. And the way I like to do that is to ask, how would you explain something to a baby? So you have a baby that knows absolutely nothing about the world, and you need to teach it how to solve an issue. And this problem could be, for example, how to tell oranges from apples. Now, the kind of traditional expert system way is to tell this baby or AI a bunch of rules that the system can apply to get to a solution. For example, we could teach you that the question to ask is the skin texture smooth? If it's yes, then it's an apple. If it's no, it's an orange. You can see though how this can quickly get kind of complicated. There might be edge cases that it doesn't know how to handle. And we have to build this system very large, since the AI has now no idea of what skin means, or texture, or smooth means. So we'd have to define all those terms through other questions. And also you can only teach the AI stuff you already know yourself this way. So the kind of newer way, machine learning, is where you don't really give the system rules by itself, but you have the system figure out the rules. So what you could do is to give the system a bunch of images, thousands even, some being oranges and other being apples, and tell it what it is. So you would say there's an orange, there's an apple, and so on. And by the time you've done this a while, the system will by itself figure out these rules. And if you give it a new image, you can apply the rules and predict whether it's an orange or an apple. So this has been really up and coming over the last few years and led to some really remarkable advancements. So today AI is used almost everywhere. If you go onto the internet, onto Google, it's probable that AI is there trying to find the most relevant results for you. It can also be used to play advanced board games, such as Go, and even beat humans. And it can be used very recently to write text. This text is entirely generated by an AI. So it was given this prompt: recycling good for the world, no, you could not be more wrong. And then the AI by itself had to write a text arguing this. And if you read this text, you will see that it's not quite sensical, but it gets the structure down and the way you would normally write such an essay. And that's really remarkable. It shows that it to some extent understands this text. So the important question here is, can this technology be used to support access to justice? And we saw before that there's a big problem of laymen not really having trouble going to court. And the question is whether we can use AI to support these people. And that's where the JusticeBot project comes in. And I would now like to show you a demo of this. This is a prototype we've been working on for some time. And it's in very early stages, but I think it demonstrates how this concept could work. So once you enter JusticeBot, you're faced with this kind of welcome screen that just explains in general what JusticeBot is and what it can do for you and so on. JusticeBot is focused for the moment on issues with bedbugs, little insects that terrorize people during the night, and it's based in Quebec jurisdiction. But this is just a very early prototype aimed to show how this would work. But as you go through JusticeBot, you're faced with a number of questions, and these are very simple questions, and it asks you to give an answer to this. For example, are there bedbugs in your apartment? And you're then also giving information about how you can determine this. For example, bedbugs often cause itchiness and bites on your skin. So let's say in this case there are bedbugs. You click yes. Next, there's some more questions, such as whether you left your apartment due to the bedbugs. Let's say no in this case. And whether you've notified your landlord of the infestation of bedbugs. Yes in this case. Then it will ask some more legally relevant questions. Again, there's some information here. Could you have been seen to contribute to the infestation? And there's also some example cases. Now you can go to these to read how the judge has reasoned, and there's also a short summary presented here to help you make that determination. In this case, say no. The next question is, did your landlord diligently deal with the bedbugs? Again, there's some information and there's a number of example cases. In this example, there's a lot of cases. There's some where the judge found that the landlord did deal with bedbugs. You can read the summaries here. And there's also examples where the judge found that the landlord did not sufficiently address the bedbugs. And here are some examples of that. So what you can do is you can read these summaries and read these cases to understand what is the most similar to your case, and to be able to find the answer to this question. The computer doesn't do this for you, and this is an important point that I'll get back to later, but it gives you the tools to be able to make this assessment yourself. Let's say yes in this case. Finally, it asks whether you support the efforts of the landlord to exterminate the bedbugs. Again, some examples. Let's say yes in this case also. So finally, you're shown a summary of the answers you've given. there are bed bugs, you've notified the landlord responded quickly, and so on. Then you're given some information about this legal issue, and finally you're giving some example cases. These are cases where the judge reasoned in a similar way, that is, he applied the criterion in the same way. And you can see an overview over what the outcome was in these cases. So as you can see here, there seems to be a rent reduction between 10 and 50%, most maybe around 15%. And there's information that could be really interesting for you in knowing what you could expect if your case goes to court. So the system shows user information in order to support them in their decision making. And the information you can see is information about the potential outcome of your case. And we think this would be really useful, for example, in an online dispute resolution context. Online dispute resolution is the use of alternative dispute resolution, such as negotiation, mediation, and arbitration, generally conducted by a neutral third party, but in a dematerialized context, that is, online. Now imagine the following situation. Two parties enter this, but they have very different expectations of what the outcome should be. The defendant might only want to pay $100, whereas the plaintiff expects a settlement of $8,000. Obviously here it's very unlikely that they'll be able to find an agreement and the case might go to court. But if you show these people statistics on previous cases, as you saw on the prototype, maybe their expectations will be aligned. And now they're much closer together and they'll be able to find a settlement. So we think a tool like this could really increase legal harmony between these individuals. Now, normally if they would have gone to court, they would have gone through a very adversarial, very long process, which might make cooperation after this fact very difficult. But through this system, they can come to a solution together, and this might make them more likely to collaborate in the future, and also to feel ownership of the solution. Now, this could contribute to social peace. If more people are able to solve their legal issues in this very straightforward manner, on a societal level, there will be more social peace. It could also reduce court caseload, as in maybe the more complicated cases go to court instead of the ones that can be solved with tools like this. And it could increase the rule of law, as there's a structured way for people to solve their case according to the laws. So let's talk about how this prototype was built and how we are working on expanding this to new legal areas. And think about how a judge would deal with a case. They'd be faced with some factual situation, and they would apply the law to this to come to a decision. This is a very simplified view, but it's essentially what a court would do. In our case, we were dealing with the Code Civil de Quebec. In 1854, there's a paragraph that says that landlords have a legal obligation to guarantee tenants peaceable enjoyment of rented apartments. And a typical issue that comes up is the infestation of bedbugs. So that's the first situation we dealt with. Courts have developed a set of criteria to determine the distribution of the liability between the parties here. And this depends, as we saw before, on the action of the landlord, but also on the cooperation of the tenant. And based on this, the judge might order rent reduction or moral damages. So this is from case law and from legislation. The courts have developed a kind of a schema, a set of criteria on how to solve these issues, to distribute the liability between the parties. And this is a very simplified version of that. But the first question is kind of, are there bed bugs? Yes or no? If there is no bed bugs, there's a case likely won't go further than that. But if there are bed bugs, the question is whether the landlord adequately responded to this issue. Yes, no. And finally, if the tenant assisted the landlord in solving this issue. For example, whether he cleaned his apartment before the extermination. Again, yes, no, and then there's an outcome, such as the rent reduction or moral damages. But as you see, this schema isn't really enough for us to help people, because it doesn't specify what these criteria mean. Did the landlord adequately respond to an issue with bed bugs, for example? It doesn't really help us applying this in a specific case. But this is where case law comes in, and this is where we go to court case decisions to understand how these criteria are applied by judges. So there's kind of 4 different parts that we need to build here, 4 different research areas that we need to construct in order to build an expert system that can help people like this. First of all, we need to code cases. We need to go through case law and for each of them translate them into a way that the computer can understand them. Next, we need to provide the user with a way to input their case data. That is some kind of user interface that they can go through to input their case. Next, we need to use the artificial intelligence that's done inside the system to compare the case of the user to coded cases that we've saved before. And finally, we need to show the results of this analysis to the user. So how do these steps work in practice? Well, so first of all, we need to code the cases. We're super lucky to be working with 1 million cases by the Logement de Québec. And we need to turn these, we have them in text, so we need to annotate those to turn them into vector representations. That is lists of numbers that the computer can understand, essentially. So the first part here is to identify the structure. As I mentioned, judges tend to apply a set of criterion in order to come to a solution in legal cases. We need to identify these by going through cases and seeing how did the judges reason. And we've developed an interface that allows us to do this. It's kind of a drag and drop interface where you can structure the criterion like a flowchart and link them together using different answers. And next, we need to go through these cases, and for each time the criterion is applied, we need to identify what the answer was, so we can compare it later, but also the explanation, why a judge reasoned in a certain way. Oops. And this we're doing through a modified chatbot interface. So through this interface, a person would go, an expert annotator, answer to each of these criterion or say how the judge answered a specific criterion in a case, and also kind of provide a summary of the motivation for that decision. So by the end we have a list like this. At the top here you can see the questions, the criterions, and then for each case we have the answers and also the reasoning, why a judge reasoned, arrived at this answer. So as you can see, for example, case 2, the judge found that there were bed bugs, the landlord adequately responded, and the tenant assisted the landlord. And based on this, there's a specific outcome to this case. Next, we need to obtain user input. That is, we need to take the user case and encode it into the same representation of answers to these criteria. And we want to use this to find similar cases and show these to the user so that they can have a better idea of what they can expect should they go to court. So we need to build some kind of user interface that allows people in a simple way to go into the system to answer a bunch of questions, and then we want to have their case encoded in this vectorized form. So we saw before how this works. The person is shown the questions and a small motivation that explains the significance of this question. And then we're giving them example cases. That is, cases where this issue has been applied before and how the judge reasoned in coming to a solution. Now, it's important to note here who makes the interpretation. It's not really the artificial intelligence that interprets the law here and applies the law to the facts. We're just giving the tools to the person so that they can do this themselves by looking at the previous case law that we've encoded. So the role of the AI here is to provide the human user with all the tools necessary to very quickly understand this question and to be able to come to the answer that they think the judge might make. So next we need to compare cases. We have identified the answers of the user, in this case yes, no, yes, and we want to find similar cases so that we can show them to the user. So what we're looking for is the most similar case. Now this might sound easy, but it can actually be kind of tricky. as Sandstein wrote in the essay on analogical reasoning. In short, everything is a little bit similar to or different from everything else. And so the question is, how do we compare these cases to each other? And in our case, the focus here is on usefulness. We want to compare them in a way so that the outputs are useful to a user and so that we can increase access to justice. So one way of doing this is to look at the answers and to see which cases share the most answers that are similar. So in this case, for example, both these cases, the judge thought they were bed bugs, but the landlord did not adequately respond, and also that the tenant assisted the landlord. So these cases are likely to be similar to some extent, and showing this information could be really interesting for the user. And next, you need to show the results to the user. And we've identified the similar cases, and we want to give these results to the user. And we saw before how this works also. The user is given a list of cases and the outcome of these cases. And this is kind of what they can expect if the judge answers the criteria as the user thinks they would. These are examples of these cases, and this might be extremely useful information for the user in understanding what they can expect and kind of what could potentially happen if the case goes to court. But it's important to note here that the distinction between legal information and legal advice. Giving legal information is allowed, but giving legal advice is limited by the bar in many countries, including the province of Quebec. And so it's important to note that this system doesn't really provide legal advice. It only gives information by showing cases. It's the user themselves that makes the interpretation, and the system shows them information by finding the most relevant cases for them. And then the user themselves can decide what to do with this information, how to proceed. So I think this has some implications, discussing a bit more broader issue whether lawyers will be replaced by AI. If you look at a system like this, I think it's interesting to think about this. Many people seem to look at AI kind of like this kind of killer robot that will come and replace jobs. But I like to look at it more as a tool. It's a very good tool for some use cases. It can be really useful, but you still need a person to wield this tool. And I think, as we can see with the JusticeBot project, using AI in law is kind of an opportunity. It allows the legal field to address sectors that maybe didn't have proper access before. As we saw in the beginning, it can be really hard for laymen to find solutions to their legal disputes. But using tools like this, the coverage of the legal area can be expanded to cover also laymen. And one part of this that we want to investigate further, we want to see what can AI do in the legal field. And for that, we've designed the JusticeBot Challenge. So using the 1 million cases of the Régie de Logement, we also want to use these to see what can AI do today in the legal field. So the aim of the challenge is to prove the feasibility of using machine learning in law for some tasks, but also to work together with some of our collaborators around this shared task, to compare approaches and to find out what the best way to design systems like this is. So for this challenge, we look at the judicial decisions in a very simplified manner. We see that most judicial decisions start out with a description of facts. That is a description of what happened in a certain case, usually by the different sides, the parties of this issue. And then there's an analysis of these facts, where the tribunal applies the laws to come to a solution, a decision. And finally, at the very end, they specify the decision and say, for example, the landlord is ordered to pay the tenant a certain amount of money. And we separate these first two factions using natural language processing. We've designed systems that we've trained using manual annotation that's able to pretty reliably separate these two sections from each other. And to detect the outcomes, we've designed a search algorithm that looks for specific keywords and then classifies the outcome based on this. Now, with this data, we think there's a number of interesting challenges we can do. And these aren't necessarily going to replace lawyers, but they're more of an experiment to see to what extent can AI do things in law. And we have to note that the data we're working with here, it comes from the judge. So a lot of this is an interesting exploration of the data, but it shouldn't maybe be given too much practical applicability at the moment. So we designed 3 different challenges. The first being a multi-label prediction, as we call it, and that is we want to go from the text specifying the facts to a legal outcome. And we have identified kind of 10 different outcomes, or a number of different outcomes here. For example, the landlord pays the tenant pays the landlord, lease terminated, and so on. So what we want to do is we want to give this artificial intelligence the text that defines the facts, and we want to build a model that's able to predict the outcome to see how accurate this might be at predicting the outcome of a certain case based on the facts. Again, the facts are already written by a judge, so this won't necessarily translate to being able to predict outcomes of future cases, but it's definitely an interesting use of this data, we think. Challenge 2 is a bit smaller in scope. We use only cases where damages were awarded to tenants. But the idea here is to predict how much damages will be awarded to the tenants. So again, we give the AI the fact section of a legal decision, and we ask it to predict in dollars how much the judge is going to award to a tenant. And the closer you are to the real outcome, the better. And finally, we have challenge 3. This is a bit different. Here instead, we give the AI both a fact section and an analysis section, and then we want to ask the AI whether these are matching or not. That is, we might swap these around. In 50% of cases, we are giving them facts with a different analysis section from another case. And in this case, we want the AI to say, this is not matching, this is not from the same case. But in 50% of cases, it has to say they are matching. So the analysis section is actually the one from the same case as the facts. And here, the AI has to say these are matching. So this is the JusticeBot challenge. This is kind of an interesting challenge that we're doing with a number of different collaborators. And unfortunately, we've had to postpone this because of the coronavirus, but hopefully soon we'll be able to reopen this. And we think this could be really interesting to see to what extent an AI could be able to work with text, with legal text like this, and arrive at outcomes. So that was it for me today. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And I wish you a continued safe and healthy time. Thank you.